Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we are here to discuss about nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is the energy released during nuclear fission and fusion, especially when used to generate electricity, and it is the nuclear power, and it is the use of reactions that release nuclear energy to generate heat, which most frequently is then used in steam turbines to produce electricity in a nuclear power plant. So, to discuss about the nuclear process, here is France.
So, as we all know, nuclear energy is one of the main producers of electricity of our world nowadays. The energy from it comes from the different systems of the nuclear power plants. It has a containment structure that holds the nuclear reactor, which generates the whole processes. There are actually two types of nuclear process, the nuclear fission and the nuclear fusion. Here is an allotted video that further explains the two. Nuclear power plants are fueled by uranium, which emits radioactive substances. These radioactive substances are continually producing three kinds of dangerous radiation, namely alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. These types of radiation are invisible to the naked eye, and so you don't see a green glow, but sometimes they can interact with nearby phosphorescent or fluorescent materials that will glow green. This is why a green glow is associated with radioactivity. The first radiation is called the alpha particles. Alpha particles are the nuclei of helium atoms. They actually move slowly, so it won't penetrate the skin, but can actually cause a lot of damage if swallowed. Other type of radiation called beta particles. It is high energy electrons that can penetrate through paper and even part of the way into the human body, but cause less damage when they do. Gamma rays are extremely high energy electromagnetic waves that that can only be stopped with a thick lead or concrete. Next slide, please. A nuclear reactor that produces and controls the release of energy from splitting the atoms of certain elements. The energy that has been released is used as heat to make a steam which produces electricity. There are two different ways in which steam is used, namely the pressurized water reactors and the boiling water reactors. The PWRs, or the pressurized water reactors, is a type of nuclear reactor that creates nuclear power. It is where water is being pumped under high pressure to the reactor core. The heated water carries heat to the steam generator where it vaporizes the water in a secondary loop, producing steam. The steam line then directs to the main turbine that causes the generator to turn, which produces electricity. The other one is the BWRs, or the boiling water reactors. It uses boiling method to turn the generator. It is where water is being converted to steam, then recycled back into water by a part called the condenser to be used again in the heat process.
So it is important to understand the pros and cons of nuclear energy to get an idea of what this energy resource is capable of. It will help you decide for yourself whether this energy resource is a good decision for our future energy needs and for the planet. Now, what are the advantages of nuclear energy? So first is the low cost of operation. So nuclear power produces very inexpensive electricity and cheaper than gas, coal, and any other fossil fuel plants. The cost of the uranium, which is utilized as a fuel in this process, is low, and it is needed very little to produce massive power. Also, even though the expense of setting up nuclear power plants is moderately high, the expense of running them is quite low. Second, reliable source of energy. While some energy sources are dependent upon weather conditions like solar and wind power, nuclear energy has no such constraints. Nuclear power plants are essentially unaffected by external climatic factors and create predictable and steady energy output. Third is the stable base load energy. Nuclear power plants provide a stable base load of energy. The stable production of power created by nuclear power plants means that it can ideally be used in conjunction with other forms of renewable energy. For example, when the wind is blowing, nuclear plants can adjust energy output to be lower. Conversely, when the wind is not blowing and greater energy is needed, nuclear energy can be adjusted to compensate for the lack of wind or solar generated power. Fourth, produces low pollution. The overall output of pollution from a nuclear power plant is quite low compared with energy production from fossil fuels. The current consumption of nuclear energy already reduces over 555 million metric tons of emissions every year. This reduction in greenhouse gases is a great indicator of how switching to nuclear energy can help reduce our effect on global climate change in the long run. And lastly, it has high energy density. Nuclear fission is nearly 8,000 times more efficient at producing energy than traditional fossil fuels, thus a considerable amount of energy density. Because nuclear energy is more efficient, it requires less fuel to power the plant and therefore creates less waste as well.
So, as we've already covered what makes nuclear power a great option for the future of our electricity needs, however, there are also disadvantages of nuclear energy that we need to keep in mind. Here are some of the main cons of nuclear energy. First, we have the nuclear accidents. Safety is a big deal in the nuclear industry. While significant accidents are actually rare, history cannot be ignored. One of the first things most people think of when they hear nuclear power plant is the disaster at Chernobyl. Although we don't know exactly how many people died, it was estimated that there have been as many as 10,000 deaths from the long-term effects of radiation in the region. This disaster showed that no matter how safe nuclear power plants are designed to be, accidents can and do happen. Next, we have it produces radioactive waste. One side effect of nuclear power is the amount of nuclear waste it produces. Although nuclear energy production does not create any emissions, it does produce radioactive waste that must be securely stored so that it doesn't pollute the environment. Third is the impact on the environment. Possibly, the biggest concern among nuclear energy advocates is the environmental impact of uranium as a fuel source. A typical nuclear power plant generates about 20 metric tons of used nuclear fuel per year. The problem is that this spent fuel is highly radioactive and potentially dangerous. Open pit mining for uranium is safe for miners, but leaves behind radioactive particles which causes erosion and even pollutes nearby sources of water. Fourth is the security threat. While nuclear power generation is certainly different from weapons of mass destruction, it represents a threat to national security if exposed to dangerous people. Terrorists might target nuclear power plants with the intention of creating a disaster, and the uranium used to produce the power can be turned into nuclear weapons if they end up in the wrong hands. Fifth is the limited fuel supply. One of the most important considerations to keep in mind is that nuclear energy is dependent on uranium. Currently, there's plenty supply uranium, but one day it will begin to dwindle down, especially if more nuclear energy plants are built, requiring the need for more uranium. Uranium must be mined and sought out, unlike the wind or solar power, which offers a truly unlimited supply. Six is it is not a renewable fuel source. The chief raw material for the production of nuclear energy is not a renewable resource. Uranium resources are quite limited, and the mining and refining process might impact the environment. Also, the transportation of uranium is risky. Safe transportation involves significant capital outlay and a lot of energy consumption. Last but certainly not least, it is expensive to build. Despite being relatively inexpensive to operate, nuclear power plants are incredibly expensive to build, and the cost keeps rising. A recent virtual test reactor in the US estimate rose from $3.5 billion to $6 billion, alongside huge extra costs to maintain the facility. In addition to the expense of building a power plant, nuclear plants must also allocate funds to protect the waste they produce and keep it in cool structures with security procedures in place.
Application of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy produces electricity that can be used to power homes, schools, businesses, and hospitals. It needs a high level of technology to build nuclear reactors, and only countries that have signed the Nuclear Non-Posture Treaties can get the uranium or plutonium necessary. Nuclear technology can be used for a range of industrial purposes, such as seawater desalination, hydrogen generation, district heating or cooling, tertiary oil resource production, and process heat applications, such as cogeneration, conversion of coal to liquids, and chemical feedstock synthesis assistance. The high demand for nuclear energy for industrial purposes is projected to rise exponentially due to the steady rising use of energy and the finite supply of fossil fuels and the increased exposure to the impacts of fossil fuel burning on the environment. Companies like Etrabel in Belgium, Electronuclear in Brazil, and Bulgarian Energy Holding in Bulgaria uses nuclear energy for electric generation, while Energy Resource of Australia, Healthgate Resources of Palladian Energy in Australia uses nuclear energy as uranium mining. They are just some of the major nuclear power corporations working in the nuclear chain, ranging from the uranium mining, refining, and enrichment to the direct activity of nuclear power plants and the processing of nuclear waste. Here in the Philippines, in the early 1980s, the Bataan nuclear power plant was built but never went into operation. Just recently, Philippines considers reviving Bataan nuclear power project.